Right, well, hello everyone, and a big welcome to this session on the role of internal engagement in gender pay gap reporting. My name's Sarah Welfare, and I'll be chairing our session today. I run a small research consultancy called Work and Pay Research, and generally my background is in researching and writing about HR policy and practice. So I had recently a long stint at online HR service Expert HR, and a shorter one at the old Equal Opportunities Commission, looking at equal pay gaps in the private sector particularly. So I think we've got a really important topic in this session to cover, internal engagement. Clearly we've got this very external facing requirements to report publicly on gender pay gaps, and I guess the challenge will be making that have a real positive impact internally in organisations, and I think that engagement is really key to that. It's obviously not a requirement of the new reporting requirements, but I think engaging with employees generally, with line managers particularly, certainly the leadership team of organisations may be really at the heart of how to make this a real thing that your organisation owns. So I'm sure we'll touch on how reluctant we seem to be in the UK. I'm sure not alone internationally in terms of talking about pay, and certainly talking about gender pay gaps in a transparent way. And I'm anticipating perhaps some apprehension on behalf of employers, particularly around engagement on this issue, when it may be for the vast majority of organisations it will be a very new issue to talk about within their organisation. I guess one positive thing is that from the very small number of organisations that have done external reporting on this so far, they have been maybe apprehensive about the reaction from staff, but when they've actually done it, their sharing their experience has shown that they've had some questions, some positive comments, and not a kind of torrent of unrest that they might have feared as a worst possible outcome. I guess there's also a real need for some practical advice on how best to engage with frontline employees on this sort of issue, and also to really draw in the kind of people that you might need within your organisation to make this work. So, yeah, finance people, data analysts, certainly senior managers, and I guess securing people's understanding and buy-in, not just on the data process, but what needs to change as a result. So there's some sort of questions to think about. We have been given some questions that we might like to focus on in this discussion. The first one is, what is the role of internal communications in an effective approach to publication of pay gap data? So, what is that? What is that role? How can internal communications support that process? Secondly, how should employers ensure staff and stakeholders are engaged and brought into the process of generating pay gap data? And lastly, how can employees support employers in developing a response to their gender pay gap? I mean, we heard from one of the speakers earlier about talking to the people who do the jobs is often the best way to find out, what that experience is and what the barriers are and what can be done. So, without any further ado, I'd like to just introduce our two speakers, Stewart and Scarlet Harris, who are just going to say, sort of speak to 10 or 15 minutes before we open up for discussion. Linda is a partner and heads up the employment law team at Simpson Millar, LLP. She took up that post in 2011 and has specialised in employment law for over 16 years. She specialises in gender pay and discrimination law and is very active in her work as a real champion of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Scarlet is the Women's Equality Officer at the TUC, which represents the majority of trade unions in England and Wales. So she covers all aspects of women's rights and women's experience in the workplace, and I know she's led on some very high-profile work on maternity discrimination, sexual harassment, and of course equal pay. So, Linda, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, thank you very much for that, and thank you for choosing to sit in on this on this breakout session on engagement. Those 3 questions we've asked ourselves, and we also want you to ask yourself during this session, if that's okay. We certainly are not sitting up here as people with all the answers in terms of, they've got the key to internal comms or employee engagement, but I'm sure that you understand from the sessions that have gone on before this morning that there is no one quick answer to dealing with gender pay. So in terms of the role of communications in an effective approach to publication of the pay gap data. I mean, clearly as an employment lawyer, I went to the draft regulations initially to think, well, what is it that the government wants us to do? What is it that Parliament wants us to consider in terms of engagement and internal comms? Absolutely nothing in the draft regs about employers sharing any of the information that they're gathering or involving or engaging employees in the process of tackling the causes of the gender pay gap, or indeed gathering the data and publishing the data. What the draft regs tell us is, who has to gather the data, what type of employers, what data needs to be gathered, where it needs to be published, and by when it needs to be published. It doesn't say anything at all about sharing any of that information. So you might be thinking, well, hang on a moment, we don't actually have to engage at all. Legally, there's no obligation to do so. But I think it's fair to say, obviously from what we've heard this morning, and certainly it's my view and experience, that communication, internal communication, is absolutely key to getting this right, to protecting the businesses that you're in. We heard this morning too that the business case is well made out already. There is, however, a strong appetite among staff, among employee groups, to discuss gender pay with employers, with managers. So in that sense, there's already a captive audience. So whatever fears managers or directors, CEOs may have about broaching the subject, it might be helpful to know that the audience is recipient. It's wanting to engage in that sense. But about 90%, in fact, want their employer to publish the data broken down by pay grade or job type. 92% of respondents in the workforce would consider have said that they would consider pay gap data when they're applying for jobs. So clearly it's of relevance at that recruitment stage. More than half of female respondents would favour the company with the smallest pay gap, or one that is at least proactive about closing it. About 89% of employees would feel more positively toward their employer if they publish their data along with an action plan. But again, the regulations don't provide, don't confer any obligation on employers to set out an action plan. But I think that it's fairly obvious that, and it's probably, employers I think recognise that it's going to be key to setting out not only publishing the data, but what's likely to happen once it's published, and so the importance of explaining what the data means and what they're going to do about it are going to be questions that workers or employees are going to want to hear the answers to. Out of the employers who have publicly reported their gender pay gap already, not one found it to be a negative experience. And I suspect that the reason, at least in part, is that they did engage employees along the way. Now, obviously, the level of engagement may differ sectorially, from business to business in different industries. But as we heard Ailey say this morning, it's not just about engaging people, but also about telling people what you're doing, what it means, what you've found in terms of in gathering the data, and how you intend to address it, and also about bringing ideas in from the employees, asking employees essentially how it can be addressed, what their experiences are. at various levels of the organisation in those various quartiles, and then developing responses that are, of course, relevant to those that are in your business. There are some risks, of course, associated with failing to engage, or I guess failing to communicate internally. They seem fairly obvious. If you're an employer who decides that they'll do, the HR team will do the number crunching in the background, and then on the 4th of April 2018 simply publish the gender pay gap, the likelihood is it's going to raise quite a bit of question, quite a bit of panic among the workforce. Simpson Millar conducted a survey itself, and it found that as many as half of workers said that they would demand a pay rise of their employer if they discovered they were being paid less for doing equal work than their male or their opposite sex colleagues. So I think if employers are not concerned about that and how to deal with that, then there's a lot of preparation required. A little bit more ignorant than perhaps than I had imagined. Because, of course, if that is the case, the risks are that they will leak talent, and they will fail to attract good quality employees. If particularly women are checking the league tables to see whose pay gap is the highest, and they're saying that that would influence them in terms of which employers they prefer to go with, then they're factors that any good employer can't afford really to ignore. We know too that aside from leaking talent and a potential avalanche of complaints, or that could lead on to employment tribunal claim, could lead to litigation, which no employer wants, is also disengagement by staff, and poor morale or reduced employee satisfaction, and with that reduced productivity. So these are some of the factors I think that ought to, if there is a need for any other reason to engage staff, that employers really ought to be taking on. I mean, I'd be interested to hear, in terms of your own organisations, perhaps after Scarlet has spoken with you as well, about how your internal comms are set up, and whether, in relation to the gender pay gap in particular, there are steps already been taken to address it. Which brings me on nicely to the second question, which relates to how employers can ensure that staff and stakeholders are engaged and brought into the process of generating the gender pay gap data. Now, I particularly advocate a collaborative approach to this, rather than simply, the idea that numbers are crunched, they're delivered to staff, or that staff are sort of consulted on it, but actually a lot of information about people's experience at various levels of the organisation could form part of the information that is gathered to inform employers. Sure, there's the collating the data on pay and the differences in pay, but also employers need to understand the causes of that, and that'll help inform them on how to tackle and how to reduce and close the gap, essentially. So suffice to say, it's worth starting with pay transparency. At every stage, looking at existing pay schemes. Lots of employers have different types of pay schemes all over the place, and bringing those together into a simple, simplistic pay scheme that employees understand is a good first step. The way to do that, of course, is to undertake an equal pay audit, and then from which you can simplify any pay scheme, and also to agree with employees an effective pay review process, which looks at how staff progression, pay progression, works within the organisation, and how women in particular are disadvantaged by any current schemes that are underway. There is the scope for employers to work with staff to identify, of course, the causes of gender pay gap, looking at those obstacles to progression. It was suggested earlier that one of the ways of doing that might be to benchmark for line managers gender pay gap targets, and by that I mean looking at rewarding line managers for initiatives they have taken to address gender pay issues within the teams that they manage, rather than it being a case of punishing line managers for failing to hit a particular target. Because I think then the risk is that it becomes tokenistic and a kind of box-ticking exercise. Looking, of course, at reviewing flexible working offerings, and again, as we heard earlier this morning, in a way that turns the whole idea of work on its head, from the norm being, or the starting position being full-time work, to one where agile working or flexible working is the norm. Considering too how age and ethnicity impact women in the workforce as well, and are tied up there in pay and reflected in pay, looking to eliminate inherited pay gaps. So by that I mean at the recruitment stage, a woman presents for a particular role, the recruiting team understand that for that role in their organisation, the pay scale runs from 30,000 to 50,000. However, she presents at interview her previous salary is 25,000. Well, employers are the temptation to say, oh, well, in that case, your existing salary is 25, knowing but not revealing that the bottom of their pay scale is 5,000 more than that, will simply say, well, we'll offer you this role on 26 or 27. So they inherit that inequality of pay, a decision that's been taken on, rather than saying, we're going to, this is our pay scale, our lowest rate is much higher, actually, or substantially higher than what you've previously been on. That's one way of redressing that imbalance and closing that pay gap. Of course, we'd heard quite a bit about unconscious bias earlier, particularly at that recruitment stage, but also when promoting staff internally. Ensuring, for instance, that job evaluation criteria are not tainted by gender, so the factors that are being used to measure job being added, the factors that are used to value particular roles and to give them weight, are not already tainted by considerations of gender. Again, I think that that it's worth employers, in a sense, drawing up action plans, but getting buy-in from employees. And I think, given what we know about employees wanting to have this dialogue, wanting to enter into discussion with employers about what they're doing to address causes of the gender pay gap, and how they can eliminate it, work toward eliminating it within their organisations, drawing up almost agreements with staff, if you like, on how to do that. Certainly in other countries, in other European countries, employers are legally required to draw up action plans and set out exactly how they propose to deal with gender pay issues and gender pay gaps within their organisations. In terms of the question about what staff might do to support employers, suffice it to say, it's not, from my perspective, the employee's responsibility to sort this out. It's certainly not women's responsibility of women. Women are not to blame for the gender pay gap, but that's not to say that there isn't a great deal of input that employees could contribute to the whole process, whether it's gathering the data, whether it's analysing the data, whether it's looking at the causes the gender pay gap and working with managers, working with employers to close the gap, then there's a significant contribution to be made there. I was struck by Ailey's some of her slides earlier today, which ended communicate at every level, at every step of the way. It's not only important to do what you say you're going to do as an employer, as a manager, but to remind people, to tell people, to be accountable to people for what you have done. Somebody once gave me that tip in terms of being a good leader. A good leader will not only deliver, but will remind people that's what they did. So that it engenders trust in management, essentially. And when staff see managers deliver, they buy in. They buy into it. They want their organisations to succeed. They don't want their organisations to be on the league tables at the top with the widest pay gap. So on that note, I think I'll leave it to it.
Thank you, Linda. Really interesting contribution. Over to you, Scarlett.
Thank you. Linda has covered lots of the things that I would say. We did talk beforehand and agreed that we both had very similar views on this, and perhaps a way of dividing it up was for me to talk more specifically about workplaces where there are trade unions. So if we're talking about how employers are engaging with workers, thinking that actually lots of workplaces there are no trade unions, so you are talking about those one-to-one conversations and how employers actually get to their workers and how they engage them. But in unionised workplaces it's quite different, and there are structures in place. And I thought it would be useful to start off actually with a bit of background about trade unions, recognising that not everyone knows much about trade unions. You may work in workplaces that don't recognise trade unions, but forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know and you're all card-carrying trade union members and activists. But first of all, there are over 50 trade unions affiliated to the TUC, so we act as an umbrella body for the trade union movement in the UK. And that's nearly 6 million workers that are covered by all of those trade unions. And actually half of those are women, just over half, so it's 55%. I think the figure was mentioned earlier that it's just under half of the working population are women, but just over half of the trade union population are women. So we're doing quite well on that front. Not that you'd necessarily know it when you see pictures in the media of who trade union leaders are, but we are doing surprisingly well. So unions represent workers in all sorts of jobs, and it's one of the things I love about my job actually, is that it gives you an insight into all sorts of different sectors. And I think it's very easy, and lots of the people I've spoken to today and some of the presentations I've heard, it's very easy when we talk about the workplace to think about our workplace and to imagine our sector and what we understand about what work is and the people around us and the jobs they do. And it's often very hard to make that mental leap and think, actually, what about the woman cleaner? What about the night shift worker? What about all these different jobs, actually some of them quite unusual jobs, but lots of people do them and they face very different experiences, and actually some of the same experiences as well. So one of the interesting things about my job is having that kind of broad overview and understanding how things work in different sectors. As many of you will know, the trade union movement is stronger in the public sector than the private sector. So it's 55% density trade union membership in the public sector, but only 14% in the private sector. And I think lots of the organisations we've been talking about today have been private sector. This is being rolled out in the private sector, but it's also going to be rolled out in the public sector as well. So it's relevant to both. Unions tend to be in the news a lot for industrial action, and I think anyone who's travelled up today on southern trains will have images of trade unions being on strike, but there are lots of other things that trade unions do that are very relevant to this. So one of the things we obviously do is representing individual members. That may be in equal pay claims, it may be in all sorts of other cases, and also bigger collective cases. So today there's a news item about Uber, GMB unions taking Uber to court over some of their employment practices. So it's kind of pushing those boundaries of actually what is it okay for employers to do. We campaign on big issues, all sorts of interesting issues actually, and recently lots of unions were campaigning around the EU referendum, for instance. So some of the unions get very involved in political campaigns, others not so much. And we've had other recent high-profile campaigns such as the Unite Union campaigning about conditions at Sports Direct, which has generated a lot of news interest. But crucially, in terms of relevance to this topic, what unions do is they collectively bargain. So they bargain for a better deal for workers. The core principle of trade unions is that everyone speaking together with a collective voice has more power than one individual worker standing up saying, wait a minute, I don't think I'm being paid the right amount of money here. So we collectively bargain around a whole range of things, pay being one of the most crucial ones, but also annual leave, pensions, maternity and paternity leave, support for childcare, flexible working, rest breaks, overtime, a whole range. We've even got, one of the things I've been doing a lot of work on recently has been around violence against women and domestic violence, and lots of unions have been looking at how they can bargain for paid time off for women who've experienced domestic violence in order for them to get to court, to find a new home, to get to different appointments. So it's the collective bargaining which really characterises what trade unions do. Lawyers like Linda will take individual cases in terms of equal pay. Campaign organisations like Fawcett do a brilliant job of campaigning around equal pay, but it's only unions that have that collective voice in the workplace to hold employers to account. And it really does pay off. I know it sounds a bit like this is an advert for trade unions, but it partly is. That's what we have to do, go out and advertise what we do. But I think it's relevant. So one thing that few people are aware of is there's actually a trade union wage premium. So trade union members are paid more than non-trade union members. But interestingly, that trade union wage premium is 25% for women compared to 8% for men. So there's a huge value for women to be trade union members. And collective bargaining actually has an important role to play in closing the gender pay gap. So the International Labour Organization and other organisations have also found that the gender pay gap is lowest in countries where collective bargaining coverage is high. That's not the UK, by the way. We've got one of the worst coverage for collective bargaining in the world. And when I go to meetings in Europe, my trade union colleagues there look at me with pity and shake their heads about what a shameful state our trade union movement's in here. The European Commission estimates a 1% increase in social dialogue coverage, so that's those kind of collective bargaining agreements with employers, reduces the gender pay gap by 0.16%. So the greater the amount of collective bargaining, the smaller the gender pay gap. And that's been found time and time again. And Norway is an example of that. So, for example, in Norway, there's been a progressive narrowing of the gender pay gap since 2008, and that has been attributed by lots of different people to the role of collective agreements. There's much higher collective bargaining in Scandinavian countries, really strong trade union movement, and it's understood there that that has led to a decrease in the gender pay gap, particularly for women in female-dominated sectors. So this is all bread and butter stuff for trade unions. We do it's every 2 years, survey of trade unions to find out what work they're doing on equality. And gender pay gap and equal pay consistently comes out as the thing that unions are doing most work on, and producing the most guidance and also having the most success in terms of what they're winning from employers. So this is a big deal for us. And there are lots of other things we do around equality, but gender pay gap probably tops the list there. Just going back to the questions that kind of structured how we're approaching this, I think the first question that I looked at was how companies engage with their workforce in terms of gathering the data and interpreting the findings and acting on them. And as I've said, I think unions are really key to this. Where there is a union in the workplace, they're probably doing this stuff already. They probably know a huge amount about what's going on in the pay structures and what the problems are. And it doesn't make sense for large employers with trade unions to not talk to the unions. And what comes to mind as an example, I don't know if many of you remember the Think Act Report initiative, which preceded this, where it was a voluntary approach to gender pay gap reporting, which was announced with a lot of fanfare and ended up with a tiny handful of companies actually reporting on gender pay gaps. They're reporting on all sorts of other interesting things, but not gender pay gaps. And I remember going along to the launch of it with ministers and business leaders and some very high-profile business names. Some of those names have come up in discussion this morning. Some of them may even be here, talking about the wonderful work they're doing, having signed up to this initiative and how important it was to them and how it was a big deal. They were signing up, they were the trailblazers who had signed up to this Think Act Report initiative. And going back to the office and getting on the phone to some of the unions that have recognition with those companies, and they knew nothing about it. And they were very shocked because actually they were dealing with a whole handful of equal pay cases, all covered by confidentiality and gagging clause agreements that they couldn't talk about. But no one had spoken to them. No one had said, oh, this is something the company wants to do more work on. And clearly, the unions are there doing this work. They know what the problems are with the pay structures. They know where there are equal pay cases happening. And no one had thought to have that conversation with them. So I think it makes a lot of sense for employers to be talking to the unions. As has been discussed earlier, and I think Linda mentioned, the draft regulations call for the information to be set out very clearly in English on an accessible website as well as on a government website. And I think we'd probably like to see more than that. And actually going back to what I said about different workplaces, and we all think about our own workplace and how we use the intranet and how we have access to a computer. Lots of workplaces don't, lots of workers don't actually have very good English skills, let alone access to a computer and good digital skills and access to an intranet. I think there's something there about conversations. I think that's come up today, that employers need to be talking to staff as well, and where there are unions in place, that's very easily facilitated because you have meetings that you can have these discussions to ensure that everyone understands what this is about and what it means for them. And I think one of the other things that's come up has been about the narrative element of this, and we hoped that that would be in the regulations, that employers would have to publish a narrative, but it's not in there. But I think actually a lot of employers will want to, because some employers, it will look very bad, but they may think they have actually good reasons and explanations for why their gender pay gap is what it is. And similarly, there might be employers where their pay gap looks very good, but it doesn't mean it's a great place for women to work. So you can think of an example of a female-dominated cleaning company where they're all on incredibly low pay, but there's no gender pay gap because everyone's on terrible pay. That doesn't mean it's a great place for women to work, or that they don't have any work to do around pay. And actually that comes to mind in this discussion about league tables and the idea that there'll be pressure put on employers by the fact that women won't apply for jobs at those companies where the gender pay gap is bad. But I think that's slightly problematic because it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad employer. And the converse of that is, would you want to encourage all of these women to go to that low-paid cleaning company where there is no gender pay gap? No, because that's not a great career option for them either. There may be good things going on within that company to mitigate that, and good reasons why, well, not good reasons why they have a gender pay gap, but there may be explanations, and there may be also, I suppose the other thing is that you don't want all women not then applying to that company. You end up with this company with a terrible gender pay gap and no women working there. You kind of want women to go in and change it as well. So yes, I think the information needs to be very clearly discussed with workers, and for those conversations to take place in the workplace. I also had a question I was given about how employers can ensure that workers buy into the whole process. And I personally don't think that is a big problem. I think in unionised workplaces, they are pretty bought in. They've been campaigning for this for years and years, and they're doing lots of work in this area, and they will want to engage on this. I can't imagine there'll be many situations where they're saying we don't want to have that conversation, it's not relevant to us. I think it'll be pretty relevant to everyone. And finally, and going back to this question about how staff can support employers, I have exactly the same response. I don't think it is down to the staff to support employers in terms of gathering the data and developing a response. I think it's up to the employers to do that, but I think that unions have a really crucial role in holding employers to account, but also in terms of understanding the gaps and understanding the data that they come up with, because of all the people who understand what's going on in a workplace, unions tend to know what's going on. And we've often found that. We were having discussions recently with the Government Equality Office about the new consultation on public sector pay gap reporting, and we got a whole load of unions around the table, and we were talking about findings around the public sector pay gap increasing. And the amount of knowledge in the room, sort of that we at top level looking at the data, I think that's interesting, I wonder what's behind that. And then you get unions in the room talking about what happens, what bonuses you get there, what's happened to this part of the workforce that's been outsourced, what's happened here, what new regulations, did you know that whole of HE has been transferred from public to private sector, and all of these things that come into play. That the unions were telling the Government Equality Office stuff that they really didn't know, because they're not in those workplaces, and it is hard to kind of get to grips with what happens in an individual workplace. And as Linda said, other countries, there has been a clear requirement for action plans, and that's the other thing we would have really liked to see. I don't want this to be a sort of a long list of things we wish had been in the regulations that aren't there, but we think that action plans are really crucial. There is no point in gathering all of this data and reporting on it if you have no idea what you're going to do with it. So I think in Finland, Germany, Sweden and France, in all of those countries, employers are required to publish an action plan and report on measures that they're taking to narrow the gender pay gap. And that's very much, even though it's not something that's being required of employers, it's certainly something we would like them to do. And I think that's what I'd like to end on, actually, before opening the discussion, is that to bear in mind that these draft regulations that we're looking at, it may be that you're only required to do so much, but I think there's a huge amount more that employers can do. They don't have to be limited by that. There's nothing to say that a company with fewer than 250 employees couldn't do this stuff as well. There's nothing to say you can't publish a narrative or publish an action plan or engage with employees in a whole different way. So I think there's lots more that employers can do beyond what they have to do.
Thanks, Scarlett, and really interesting to hear, to build on this morning's discussion with the trade union perspective as well, and the helpful reminder of what unions are and what they do. So thank you for that. We've now got about 20 minutes, so if anyone would like to kick off our discussion, it would be great if you could just say where you're from and wait for the microphone as well. Does anyone have any questions for either of the speakers, or if anyone would like to share any insights from their experience in their own organisation, that would be really useful. Go on, be brave. Otherwise, I'll have a question. Okay, go on, Helen.
Break the ice. Thank you. I'm Helen Wollaston. I run WISE, which is a campaign working with business to get more women in science, technology, engineering, working in CSU. I'm just interested if, because of the context WISE where I work in and the companies we work with, if there's been any, if you think there's a risk or you've picked up anything anecdotally where men in the workplace feel defensive because they maybe there'll be a trading down, basically, that in order to get rid of, reduce the pay gap, actually the whole wages will come down to the level that women are at, and therefore obviously men are not going to want that, trade unions are not going to want that. So is there that part of is there a challenge there or not?
I'm not coming across that, to be honest. I'm not saying it won't happen in any workplaces, and I can't remember who I was talking to recently. We were talking about, I think a couple of universities have kind of jumped the gun on this one a little bit and thought about doing it earlier and have looked at their pay gaps and have taken action to increase across the board women on certain grades pay because they recognised there were pay gaps and they were going to be in trouble. And I think I'm right in saying that in some of those universities the question was put by the unions, would you should we depress the men's pay in order to get pay parity, or should we increase the women's pay? And when it was put to the men that maybe their pay could go down, it was agreed across the board that the women's pay should probably go up in order to achieve an equal footing. So obviously those questions are arising about where there are pay gaps, how do you smooth them out, and is that going to mean a downward pressure on men's pay? But it's not something I'm coming across a lot. Slightly more, I think one thing that's kind of on our radar is the fear that employers where they have a lot of women concentrated in very low paid roles that are very easy to outsource, there could be a big incentive to just outsource them. So where you have a workforce where it's predominantly men doing quite well and you have a lot of women in cleaning or catering roles, for instance, that are very easy to just outsource, then it kind of shifts the problem onto someone else. So that's a slight concern. Definitely.
I've had absolutely no inquiries from men concerned about a possible reduction in salary in consequence of the implementation of these draft regulations. And I suspect it's partly due to the fact that a quite substantial number of men in any workforce, certainly I'm taking this from the Hayes survey 2006, 86% of men believe that there is no pay gap in their organisations. So I think that even one step before, one step prior to the realisation that, hang on a moment, this could mean that my pay needs to be adjusted or something. Maybe my organisation will choose that route to dealing with the gender pay gap. It might just simply reduce us to this, to this level. I think they're not there yet. I think they're still thinking. I think they're still thinking that that there is no pay gap. At least that's what they're saying in response to survey questions. That they believe that there is pay parity already in their organisations, and so there's no issue.
I think that's a really interesting point. We come across that a lot. There's often this sort of perception lag in terms of terms of men thinking that there is no problem, and I came across this recently, the work I mentioned on domestic violence and getting leave for domestic violence, and some of the Italian unions had negotiated 6 months paid leave for domestic violence. And when we asked how on earth did you negotiate that, they said that they went to the men and said this is what they want, and the men said absolutely fine, because we don't think that anyone within our organisation has experienced domestic violence, therefore no one will ever ask us for this leave, so that sounds like an excellent idea. So I think there's often a bit of a gap between what people's understandings are of the problem and therefore what the solutions are.
Any other questions or comments?
Hi, thank you. I'm Helena from Boudica Air. I'm going to be cheeky and greedy and ask 3 questions, if that's okay. So the first one is, have the companies that you've been engaging with talked about the emotional reaction to the results will be published? I can imagine there'll be a fair swell of anger, as well as perhaps excitement to how small the gaps may be, but also how large the gaps may be. So something about planning for that emotional reaction and getting closure on historical gender pay gaps. The second one is, how are we making sure that companies are not fudging their numbers? It's some departments within organisations are extremely good at managing the message well and shaping it such that actually they are hiding the truth. And the third one is, as we then look forward to kind of getting closure and creating the action plans we're talking about, what thought are companies putting into actually using it as an opportunity to engage in genuinely caring for their colleagues, you know, in addition to equal pay, but actually using it as an opportunity to say, okay, what is the culture that we need to have in our organisation moving forward?
Interesting. Linda, would you like to take any of those issues? Either the reaction, I guess, and trying to...
Fudging the numbers, and then an opportunity to create a new kind of working culture.
Well, I mean, our own survey shows that, you know, nearly 50% of workers say that they would demand a pay rise. So, I mean, there's got to be fear, I suspect, around that type of reaction. You know, is publishing the gap going to lead to, you know, are we going to have suddenly all these women on our doorstep, on the doorsteps of HR, demanding pay rises, or worse, are we going to have claims issued against us in the employment tribunal en masse? And there have been plenty of those historically. And so I think that there is a concern there, but I'm not convinced that employers see that the way to deal with it or the way to manage it is to engage employees in the process. So, I mean, that's why I'm advocating at the earliest possible, you know, collaboration with employees, engagement with employees at the earliest possible stage, whether that's through, you know, recognised trade unions, as Scarlet has explained, or where the workforce isn't unionised, the workplace isn't unionised, through setting up employee working groups, employee forums, specifically with this remit to advise boards, to advise HR on issues, on how to manage the issues. So I think, yeah, there's, in terms of the emotional response, I don't think employers know how to manage it at this stage. I mean, I'm quite happy to be corrected if you have other experience of your own organisations or the...
Not from my organisation. I'm from the Women's Equality Party. We hire lots of women. We don't have a figure.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got a mic coming towards you.
There was somebody just mentioned this morning that Bloomberg had run a story saying that now is the time to ask for a pay rise. That if you're a woman and you think that you have a case, you have sort of between now and April 2018 to persuade your employers that it'd be a really, really good time for them to get out in front of this. So I just wondered if any of you have heard anything or had those kind of conversations with employers who are, you know, getting out in front of it.
If we stick on that issue and the emotional reaction, I think I heard just before you want to come in, Scarlet, I heard a very interesting presentation from one of the firms that had quite recently taken the step of publishing, a large firm publishing their pay gap data externally. And they were this deals more with your question, to be honest, but they were very apprehensive about the reaction they would have from their staff. And they found it was an extremely positive reaction. They had a couple of questions Some people just sort of curious really about the information, how that fitted in with actually what they do specifically in their organisation. But it was interesting that that's a company that is very transparent in how it does everything already. So I guess having those building blocks already in place in terms of your pay structures and your transparent practices is obviously going to be very important in how people react to the data, I think, when it comes out.
It's quite interesting to think about it in the first place, because if there is a genuinely large gap of any kind in that space, and actually if... Sorry, just project my voice and project something normally. It's just quite interesting intellectually if you think about it, if there is that gap there, and it's identified through transparent early reporting, which is great, but actually that even if people aren't sort of going, well, hang on, actually, how... they accept, okay, well, there was a gap, well, at least now we know we can move forward. To be so accepting is quite an interesting position to be, with no sort of almost like emotional reaction. One would accept that it's okay that I was paid less, but actually now let's have a conversation about how we close that gap. I'm just wondering, at a human level, why one would not have some kind of rational or emotional reaction to that new piece of information, even if it be confirmation of what you kind of guessed or had ascertained originally. It's just, yeah.
Scarlett, do you want to come in either on that or on the issue of the reaction in terms of equal pay requests for closing that gender pay gap?
Yeah, no, I think those are really interesting questions. And I think on the emotional reaction, I think what occurs to me when you're speaking is that it's worth drawing the distinction between equal pay and gender pay gap. And I think you're absolutely right. If you discover that the man working next to you is being paid more than you for doing the same job or less of a job, as it may be, I think you're right. You'd have a very visceral emotional reaction to that and feel very, very angry if that was exposed. But the top line gender pay gap reporting figures that we're going to see will expose, that might be part of what they're exposing, but it'll be other things as well that I think actually women probably are perfectly aware of within their workplace, like the stuff around occupational segregation. I think if you work in a workplace where all of the bosses are men and all of the women are effectively in what was the typing pool, you know that. You look around you and you see it and you know they're all paid more than you and you know that they have different perks and different working conditions to you. So I think it will be confirming what people already know, and they'll probably be quite pleased to see it out in the open. The male bosses at the top might not be so pleased to see it in the open, and they might have a different emotional reaction. But I think there's a different reaction depending on what it is that's uncovered. So I think that's important. I think the question about fudging the numbers is really important as well, because it touches on something that wasn't really raised this morning, which I think is crucial about enforcement. And again, harking back to what we would have liked to see in the draft regulations, I think having a requirement to publish with no powers to enforce that is not ideal. And I think employers will know that. There'll be that gentle pressure of it looks bad if you haven't done it, and you won't be on that league table, or you might get questions from employees about why you haven't done it. You might get the odd phone call from the Government Equalities Office, or whoever might be chasing you up about it. But there's no teeth to it in terms of enforcing it. And I think the same goes for fudging numbers. And yes, I think the draft regulations are very clear about what it is that you should publish and how you should do those calculations. So I think it is fairly well set out what you need to do. But if you can find a clever way around it, whether that's discounting a large proportion of employees by outsourcing them and making them not employees anymore, whatever you choose to do, I think there's going to be very limited resources to scrutinise and enforce what companies are doing, which I think is a shame. Although, having said that, I don't anticipate that lots of employers will be fudging it, because, as I say, it is very clearly set out. It's not that hard to do. But yes, I think
that pressure can come from within the organisation as well. And all employees need to do is ask the questions. Where did the numbers come from? How did you calculate it? Who was compared? How did you arrive at these quartiles? Those sorts of things. So just keep asking the questions and putting the internal pressure on. And in a way, it's an opportunity. I mean, it can be presented as an opportunity for employers, because it's to say, look, better that we ask the questions than than you carry on failing to recruit the best talent for the organisation, because external candidates are not going to ask you those questions. But so better that we deal with it here. We want this to be the best organisation, the best business. We want to be good at what we're doing. We want to be known externally for being good at what we do. So let us understand it. Just in the same way that having a clear pay structure enables everybody to understand exactly what they're being paid for, what their paycheck represents, where they are in the business, that kind of thing.
And just on Sophie's question, I'm not sure I can answer it completely, but I think it's right. I think people have said this morning that this does present a huge opportunity, and it's created a climate around at least talking about the issue. I think there's been a lot more in the news recently about gender pay gap and the factors behind it, and I think people sort of understand a little bit more that we're not just talking about equal pay, we're talking about all these other factors that play into this. So yes, I think that does make sense. I think it's probably always a good time to ask for a pay rise, but there's never a bad time. But I think it's about asking for the other things as well, recognising this isn't just about equal pay. It's about pushing employers on flexible working and creating more well-paid, high-quality part-time jobs, talking to them about job design, all of those things that we've been talking about this morning. I think just in terms of there being that climate of employers, maybe their ears being slightly more open to this and recognising that there's a bit more scrutiny, a bit more public discussion, and that it might be a good time to start having those conversations.
Does anyone else want to come in with other comments or questions on that? I guess one issue that raises for me is, is there a sort of education gap around this issue that needs addressing when we're talking about communicating within companies? Certainly with the whole issue of the sort of gender pay gap being very different from equal pay, that could potentially cause understandings. The actual figures, I guess, knowing that this is a mean, this is a median, is there a need for, organisations to put a bit of effort into explaining this? Or
I think it's absolutely crucial that comes from employers, and that it's because it gives context to the figures that are being reported. And you're right, Scarlett. Workers know what the situation is on the at the coalface. They know what it's like when you've got all your managers are men and all the women, all the people that you work with are women. And certainly trade unions are able to offer, be engaged in all of that. But yes, I think.
And I was just going to say on that as well, I think probably in terms of whether employers need educating as well, I don't know if that was part of the question. I think lots of large employers with big HR functions probably understand very well what all the factors are and what the difference is between the mean and the median and how you can measure the pay gap in different ways, and you'll come up with completely different answers depending on whether you're looking at part-time, full-time, mean, median, all of those things. But perhaps lots of smaller employers won't, and I think there's probably a lot of fear amongst smaller employers. Obviously these regulations only apply to those with over 250, but actually if you had 250 employees spread over a couple of sites, that could be quite a small company with a small HR function that might struggle with some of this. And I suppose the only thing I'd say is there's a lot of really good information out there. The EHRC, as you know, have lots of brilliant information on their website. It's not always easy to find, but Sheila Wilde, who spoke this morning, I think was involved in producing the high-risk pay practices checklist that's on their website somewhere, if you can find it, if you Google high-risk pay practices. That's a really good guide for employers and for unions and for anyone, actually, to think about pay structures and how you can improve them and make sure that you're doing the right thing and that you're avoiding as much as possible any risk of pay gaps and unequal pay.
And I guess what about we heard a lot this morning about the business case for doing this and the moral case. If a lot of this is about securing buy-in in your organisation amongst different groups, both at the very top of the organisation and talking to employees about why this is important and why it is important both for them and their organisation. Do you have any compelling how do you go about persuading, say, if there's reluctance at the very top of the organisation, how do you go about persuading people that this is something that they do that will benefit their organisation to look at? Are there any points around that?
Well,
Helen?
something that's starting to work for us a bit is that emotional response to get them to think about their daughters. And some guys will, they start to think and they realise, only become aware of this and personally, emotionally engage with it because they don't want their daughter to be disadvantaged. So, if that works, and it does for some, then that's the way to get them involved. And it might, so there'll be people in the workforce who will be thinking, male and female, thinking about their daughters, their nieces, their granddaughters, wanting them to have the best, and that's the way to get them to see there's a reason for doing something differently.
I liked the club idea that was talked about this morning as well. It's like if you can't change the thinking, then tune into it, start where board members are at in that sense. I think that's.
Any other questions, I guess, or points that people would like to make particularly about this issue of communication within organisations when these figures come out, or in the process and run up to putting them together? If not, I think we're pretty much coming to the end of our session. So if there's not any more points, then thank you ever so much for coming along and for contributing, and being a really interesting discussion. Thank you.